And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. It's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And today, having finished our journey through the top 10 films of 1963, we commence a new expedition through the films of 64. So let's get right to it. My 10th and 9th ranked films for 1964, right now. And my 10th ranked film, which cost a mere $200,000 to produce, was one of several that received strong consideration for this 10th and final spot for 64. Others I considered were Beckett, a prestige period piece starring Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, with John Gielgud in a supporting role, but in the end, despite that phenomenal cast, I found it fairly static and overblown. There were also the two mega musicals of 64, Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady. The former creative, certainly, but just not my thing. It's a kid's movie. And the latter, a more than competent production. But as a filmed version of a 1956 musical, it's really more a product of the 50s than the 60s, I felt. And then there were also two highly praised foreign films released in 64 that I considered. Antonioni's Red Desert, his first color film, and Hiroshi Teshigahara's Woman in the Dunes, both of which, despite some truly inventive photography, I found fairly boring and pretentious. So in the end, despite its flaws, which I'll get to, Sam Fuller's black and white neo-noir, The Naked Kiss, got the nod. And Fuller, whose primary period of activity as a writer-director spanned 15 years, 1949 to 64, he did make a few films after Naked Kiss, but they were either taken from him by the studio and butchered, or were just bad, or both. But Fuller, 52 when this film was released, had arguably the most fascinating, action-packed life of any major American director ever. The two major segments of which, prior to his film career, were number one, an early stint as a tabloid journalist in New York in the 1920s. He worked his way up from copy boy at the age of 12 to crime reporter at the ripe old age of 17 at the New York Evening Graphic. And working there, teenage Sam Fuller got a quick and dirty education in the city's vast underbelly, covering every manner of crime and debauchery. So that was the first major segment of his life. The second was his service as a foot soldier in World War II. And he wasn't drafted. Fuller's father had died in 1923, so as the sole supporter of his family, 28-year-old Sam Fuller could have avoided service in 1941, but he enlisted anyway. And the primary goal of his in doing so was to report on what was, among other things, the greatest story of the 20th century. Fuller wanted action, and man did he get it. Serving with the 16th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, he took part in 3 major amphibious landings. First in North Africa in 1942, then in Sicily in 1943, and finally Normandy in 44. And his heroic action at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, a day he describes in horrific depth in his excellent autobiography, The Third Face, earned him the Silver Star. He was also awarded the Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and many other medals. And then after D-Day, he fought his way through the Battle of the Bulge, after which he made his first film, an amateur production with a handheld camera his mother had sent him of a Nazi concentration camp his unit had liberated, called Falkenau, in then Czechoslovakia, just documenting the atrocities there. It's not one of the more well-known camps, but I'm not sure people realize how many of these camps there actually were. Well over 1,000 in Nazi-occupied Europe. And Fuller would go on to make a number of war films, despite his stated view that no movie could ever capture or even approximate the actual experience of combat. He said, quote, "For moviegoers to get the idea of real combat, you'd have to shoot at them every so often from either side of the screen. But the casualties in the theater would be bad for business," unquote. So, despite the horrors he had experienced and witnessed, he certainly kept his sense of humor, albeit a dark one. But if you watch Fuller's films, including The Naked Kiss, you'll notice that there's often a character, it could be any character, good or bad, named Griff. And as he later explained, there was a real Griff, a fellow soldier and friend who had barely survived a mine explosion in Europe. And after the war, Fuller went down to a veterans hospital in D.C. to visit this Griff, who was in terrible physical shape. No legs, no arms, and enough facial damage that it was a challenge at times to understand what he was saying. But Griff managed to make it very clear that he did not want any pity from anyone. Somehow, this man, body smashed apart, had maintained his spirit, an optimistic view, and it turned out to be a great visit. So this repeated naming of various characters after Griff was Fuller's way of thanking his friend. Now, today's film, The Naked Kiss, is not a war film, nor is it an exploitation film, as some have called it, as it does not seek to titillate. But it is the story of a prostitute named Kelly, or really a former prostitute, as about 10 minutes into the film, Kelly rejects that life for good and attempts to reset in small-town USA, a place called Grantville, as a nurse in a hospital for disabled children, a job at which she excels. Her inner toughness and ability to emotionally detach, which ironically are byproducts of her former occupation, allow her to not be overwhelmed by the potential sadness of her surroundings. So her future would look rather promising, were it not for two factors. Number one, Grantville's police chief, named, you guessed it, Griff, is determined, after sampling her services of course, he is her final trick, to steer Kelly one town over, where there is a bordello. On the one hand, he doesn't want Kelly sullying his idyllic town, but on the other, he wants her close enough so he can see her again if the urge strikes him. So Griff is a problem. But then a second, more dramatic conflict emerges when Kelly falls in love with Grant, the town's super wealthy benefactor and namesake, who seems to love her back and charms the poetically inclined Kelly with tales of his travels to Venice and references to Goethe and Beethoven, and then proposes marriage after a disquieting moment from which the film derives its title. Immediately after their first kiss, Kelly looks distressed and pushes Grant away. But she quickly overcomes her disgust, which is unexplained for the moment, and pulls him close again. But this momentary disgust foreshadows the fact that Grant, a pillar of the community, is a pedophile. One morning, when Kelly goes to his mansion to show him her wedding dress, she spots a young girl leaving Grant's bedroom. He then confesses to Kelly what he is, and with twisted logic, explains that since she's a prostitute, or former prostitute, and he's a sexual deviant, theirs is a perfect match. Kelly, however, strongly disagrees and registers her disapproval by bashing Grant's head in with a telephone receiver. So she is then charged with murder, as no one believes Grant could be what this former prostitute claims he is, and the girl Kelly spotted at the mansion cannot, for the moment, be found. And I mentioned the kissing scene that gives the film its title. During one of her interrogations by Griff, Kelly describes that initial kiss that disgusted her, and she informs Griff that prostitutes have a phrase, the naked kiss, which she defines as quote-unquote, the kiss of a pervert. But Fuller was inspired by an experience he had had as a teenage crime reporter. When he was chasing down a lead one night on the Upper West Side, an older colleague told him that he could save his nickel by using the telephone at a bordello that was operating on Broadway and 97th Street instead of the drugstore payphone, which he did. So Fuller got to know the madam of that bordello and several of the girls who worked there, not as a client, but as a friend and confidant. In his book, he said any sensual urges he may have had were quashed. Well, first of all, there's always that fear of disease, but just as much by the girls' kind of clinical, business-like approach to their job. So he got to know them as people, and many of them, he recalled, harbored this fantasy of meeting a rich client who might marry them so they could escape that life. Of course, this almost never came true, and one barrier they faced, Fuller believed, was psychological. Whether it was inner shame or a kind of paranoia, they all seemed to feel that no matter where they were or what they were doing, everyone automatically knew that they were prostitutes, as if a scarlet letter was stamped on their forehead, which would prevent them from being anything else forevermore. So that was one memory that led to the naked kiss, the difficulty shaking that life. The other was the social hypocrisy that Fuller observed. At that brothel, he personally witnessed numerous local politicians making use of the ladies' services. And in one case, a city councilman who had just given a press conference Fuller had covered, where he had condemned the rampant prostitution in New York at that time and had vowed to abolish it. So that hypocrisy is embodied in the film by Griff, the police chief. Now, Fuller, in the realm of direction and screenwriting, has both the virtues and flaws of the tabloid journalism he once practiced. As for the virtues, he certainly grabs your attention and makes his points very clearly. But on the other hand, he's about as subtle as a punch in the face. Some other flaws, as usual with Fuller's films, there are some bad performances to contend with, especially in the supporting roles. You know, with B-list budgets, you get B-list actors. And some of the writing is ham-handed in a kind of stylized Mickey Spillane sort of way. And there are a handful of egregious lapses in taste throughout. But the virtues, it's never boring. The photography by the old veteran Stanley Cortez is excellent. He uses very high contrast lighting, derived from that classic film noir style. And the film has a kind of crazy integrity. You know, subversive is a term that legions of nerdy film critics have applied to any number of films from the 50s and 60s, usually without any real foundation. But Fuller actually was a kind of cinematic subversive. He loved to turn over rocks and observe what crawls beneath. So his films, while crude, even barbaric, do have as compensation that kind of fresh air quality of a truth being told without compromise. And that's a quality that was rare in 1964 and perhaps even more so today. Moving on to my 9th-ranked film for 64, That Man from Rio, a French adventure comedy in the spirit of Hitchcock's North by Northwest that became a surprise international hit. Directed by Philippe De Broca and starring Jean-Paul Belmondo, who not only acts with his customary charm, but does most of his own stunts, a number of them pretty hairy. The film also stars Françoise Dorléac, older sister of Catherine Deneuve. Dorléac was the actual family name, although there's not much family resemblance between the two sisters. But sadly, Dorléac, who's in another of my top 10 films this year, higher up the list, she was killed in a car accident in January of 1967, so did not have a chance to enjoy the fame that she was just achieving at that time. Now, That Man from Rio is one of these films that was kind of put together on the fly by several different writers, which can often be a recipe for disaster, but occasionally, as here or in films like Casablanca or Tootsie, a recipe for brilliant success. Now, due in part to the film's title, That Man from Rio, and the title was the very first thing created before the story was even written, and also due to the ad campaign, which showed Belmondo wearing a white tuxedo, which he does wear in one sequence. But for those two reasons, That Man from Rio was viewed in '64 as a kind of satire of the James Bond films. Now, this was not the intention, nor is it the actuality. First of all, the hero, the Belmondo character, is not a dashing secret agent like 007, nor is he even a man from Rio. He's a working-class French soldier on leave, whose girlfriend, Dorléac, is drugged and abducted by Amazonian Indians and flown to Rio as part of a complex plot involving the theft and recovery of an ancient statuette, one of a trio of such statuettes, which, when joined together, are said to have quasi-magical properties. So Belmondo follows the kidnappers to Rio and tries to rescue his true love, and Jean Servais, who played the aging gangster in Rififi in 1955, here plays a professor and curator at the French museum from which the statuette is stolen. So he too goes to Rio, ostensibly to track down the statuette, but there's a twist which I won't reveal. So, similar to Hitchcock's films of this type, the story is really a pretext, first of all to showcase the considerable beauty of various parts of Brazil, and secondly, to set up entertaining scenes of intrigue, suspense, and adventure. All of it greatly enhanced by the disarming wit of the dialogue and Belmondo's engaging screen presence and stunts. So for Belmondo and his excellent chemistry with Dorléac, who's often quite funny herself, for the stunning color photography, the color schemes of the sets and the outfits are always carefully and beautifully chosen. For the clever screenplay, which at times made me laugh out loud, which is pretty good for a film from 1964 in a language that I don't speak. And for the insane stunts, and there's no doubt that Belmondo is doing most of them. The camera pulls in very close, and of course, this is well before digital effects. But for all these reasons, check out That Man from Rio, which, by the way, had a huge influence on Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spielberg had been entranced by That Man from Rio when it came out in '64. He was 18 at that time, and he later acquired a copy. And the similarities between the two films are abundantly clear, and Spielberg, around the time he made Raiders of the Lost Ark, actually reached out to Philippe De Broca to pay his respects and acknowledge that influence. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1964. So take care, and I'll see you soon.